The topic of the semester series is called Eine Maschine, which is also the topic of our studio, Ensemble Perio. I think you all got to know him already. He's a recent guest professor from Paris. And we organized the lecture series and invited really interesting people. So our first guest is Filip Dujardin. Next week, Rota is coming. Rota is dealing with deconstruction and construction. The 7th of December, Architektur magazine is coming here. They are not only architects, they also publish works. The 15th, so before the Christmas celebration in the woodshop, we would like to give some ideas of us, of what is for us Eine Maschine, and we give an overview of the students' work. So I think that would be nice. You can get in touch with Alexandre afterwards during the celebration, and it's the colleagues and students can have exchanges about the works. Next year, beginning of next year, TAT is coming. That's a studio. They have also an artistic approach. TAT stands for Theatre as Architecture, Architecture as Theatre. And at the final review, the 2nd of February, Adrian Verschurer is coming from Brussels. He's actually the founder of the office Baukunst and was also the co-founder of the office, which most of you, I guess, know. It's called Make In from Switzerland. Now he has his office in Brussels. About the lecture series, you find some questions and marks on the back side of the flyer, which is laying around here. I think that another time or during a discussion we can have a nice conversation about that. And now we want to welcome Filip Dujardin. He's not only architect, he's not only trained as an architect and art historian, he's also a professional photographer. He's, by the way, also the photographer of Alexandre. But here he prepared a lecture mainly about his work as an artist. He did a series which is called Fictions, not realistic buildings. It's a full montage, collage work of buildings. I think mainly surrounded in Ghent. But he gonna explain to you. I think he had, a book of his work was published by Schaffens. He was exhibited at the Highlight Gallery in San Francisco. His work is part of the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art. And so we are really happy that he took the way to come here and present his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me on this school that is legendary name of an architect, Filip. I'm quite knowing very well, from some projects at least. So I want to give you a short or maybe an extensive overview of all my activities as a photographer / artist. I'm not an architect. I was not trained as an architect. Everybody thinks I'm an architect, I'm not, and maybe I'm glad I'm not. I'm not sure why, but I have a slight impression why I'm glad I'm not an architect. So I want to guide you around in 3 steps of my activities. I'm still an architectural photographer. Some people ask why do you still do that? Because you have other things that are apparently more interesting. Not for me, because I still like photographing architecture, because everything that I do, it was evolved out of my profession as an architectural photographer, and also I like looking at buildings because it's for me very important to walk around and keep in touch with the current way of building, how architects think about space, how buildings function in the public space in cities, and that's for me a kind of a source for, by looking, it's a source of inspiration to make other work or artistic work. Nevertheless, I think photographing architecture is an artistic act as well. You can discuss about it. So the first picture I want to show you are pictures of buildings I mostly photographed in Belgium, because there's a quite interesting Belgian architectural scene going on. It's a quite interesting young or not so young generation of architects that are really working in a very specific way, and for me that's very challenging and it's an honor to photograph these projects. So just to have a small introduction, this lecture is all about the representation of architecture through a medium, and in this case we will show through the medium of a photograph, and later I will show you my three-dimensional work. So it's dealing about architecture through the medium of a photograph and an installation. So architectural photography is also dealing with dissecting or analyzing a building in as much aspects as possible. And for me it's important when I photograph a building that I can unveil the universal qualities of a building, and not so much the specific, how beautiful it is. Try to detect what architecture is in essence about. And of course the grammatics or the vocabulary of architecture is the typologies that didn't hardly change throughout 12,000 years. The wall is a typology that is already there for 12,000 years, the column, the roof. So if you look at the architectural history, for me it's very interesting to, even every time I photograph a building, is detecting these typologies and photograph them in a quite neutral way. And in some way, and you'll see it later, photographing is also, or a photo is also in some sense replacing the building, or it becomes the architecture, because the people who look at the pictures often don't see the building in real, but also only the picture of it, and use that picture as a tool in design or about thinking about architecture, but they only use the image. So the responsibility for a photographer is quite important, I think, and certainly nowadays, that these pictures are circulating from offices, and they only look at the picture, they don't, of course they are professionals, architects, they can imagine how the space is in real, but they only look at the graphics, or they can imagine how the building is conceived through an image. And of course, I have a double relationship, because I always make pictures for clients, for architects, so they expect something from me. They, of course, most of them, they want that their picture is as good, that it is presented in a very good and in an honest way. But of course, I know that photographing a building has some implications, and I want to read a text because I want to be very clear what I think architectural photography is about. Is that better? Yes. So I want to choose my words very correctly. So what in my opinion architectural photography is all about is, of course, about showing, but also about not showing, and also or suggesting things that are maybe there or they are there, I don't know. And it's also about compression and illumination. And that's, everything has to do, of course, with the frame of the camera, because the frame is very arbitrary in architectural photography. You have the frame of the picture, and you have the subject of, or the form of the actual building. So there is a kind of conflict, or there's a kind of very particular relationship between the frame of the photograph and the actual object that you are photographing. So I think it's also, in my opinion, about idealization and sublimation of the subject. I think a good photograph is dealing about, like I said before, about unveiling the universal qualities of architecture that transcends the particular of the actual project. And by doing that, it places the architecture in a 12,000 years history of architecture. I think architectural photography is also about creating architectural icons. If you want it or not. And I think it's showing architecture at its best to people who will probably never see the building in real, but only through photograph. So like I said before, in a way, the architectural photography becomes architecture itself. I think architectural photography is also about saying that the architect is right and that he made the right decision for that particular program, and showing the context where the building is built sees the contrast between the so-called undesigned context and or the environment and the new structure that is the result of the good choices made by the architect. And I think this contrast adds to the effect of a building as the ultimate alternative for a former problem, and in some cases can provide a certain surreal accumulation of structures. And in some cases, I think a good or an architectural photograph can show something that cannot be seen or cannot be observed while seeing the building in real. It sounds maybe a bit pretentious, but it can, in some cases, show the ineffable, or what wasn't designed from the beginning. Architectural photography has this strange technique of perspective corrections. And what do I mean with that? If you look at this picture, for example, of buildings in New York, you see that the lines of the buildings, they go parallel with the frame of the picture. And that's a quite unnatural way of looking at architecture, because they call it perspective correction. It's a special lens that you have on the camera that you have to keep your camera always level, water level. And you move your lens up and down, it's shifting, and that gives this effect. So the camera was water level, and you put your lens up, and then you see that the lines are still straight, but it's a quite unnatural way of looking at architecture, because normally if you look with your eye to a building, the lines go to one point. So this is also a filter that makes the image more abstract, and it becomes another reality. I don't know, this perspective correction is a kind of consensus in architectural photography. Everybody uses it, and I think it has something to do with the fact that the photo has to resemble to the drawing. The drawing of the architect is, in many cases, it's an axonometry or a perspective, and especially computer drawings, every line runs parallel with the frame of the sheet. So the picture is a kind of prolongation of the plan of the architect, in my opinion. It's my feeling. I didn't do theoretical research on that. Of course, architectural photography is also dealing with aesthetics. It's a quite maybe not the word that you can't say, but I think it's still relevant. It focuses on the silhouette of and proportions of a building. It deals with typologies, like I said before, with scale and spatial organization, with program, functionality, light treatment. Sometimes human presence reminds us that buildings are designed for people and that cities are built for communities. Looking for attention within the project or in the vicinity of the project. Typologies. A German project. Typologies. I think that's a quite interesting image because you see the typology of the column, but you see them in different forms. You see, I can use this. You see the original column, then you see a new column in concrete, and then you see this, I don't know how you call it, kind of scaffold, the scaffold, I don't know the name. It's a construction to keep something up that is on the ceiling, and then you have this kind of column, and then you have the other column in the back. So it's a kind of resume of all kinds of columns in one picture during a construction site. Other kinds of columns. Again, typologies, the chimney of the factory and the chimney of the house. It's a collage. Human scale, of course, very important. How are people interacting with the proposition of the architect? In New York, maybe a side effect of a good photograph. Let us believe that architects are making the world a better place. That's maybe a controversial phrase. And for me, yes, you can imagine if architectural photography is looking very, very concentrated at the building by moving with the camera back and forth, left and right, and using every square centimeter of the vertical and the horizontal plane in front of the subject. And looking for a balance or even a friction between the dictatorial rectangular frame and the object or the subject. And to come to the next stage in the lecture, all these insights I'm summing up right now, I got from photographing architecture for 15 years right now, or 16 years. And by publishing photographs in books and magazines, I got aware of the effect of showing architecture through the medium of a photo is, and how these photos provoke discussions and even emotions. And these qualities intrigued me, and I wanted to, in some way, to enhance these effects in another work. And of course, photographing existing buildings didn't always offer me material to make an exciting artistic image. And often I was a bit disillusioned that the building I was photographing had a lack of elegance and expressiveness to produce an exciting image. So in fact, after some time, I felt the need to control all these aspects myself. And so the best way to do that is pretending to be an architect myself, but I'm not an architect. So the best way is to pretend one and to design in some way my own structures or own buildings. And use them as on 3 levels, producing or constructing images that can give comments on the current or historic architectural production by giving a mild critique. It's not a manifest for another kind of architecture, it's just looking what is already done and interpret it in another way or giving a slight shift towards another meaning. And of course, I'm very intrigued by the sculptural quality of architecture as well. I think everybody who studies architecture is in the beginning intrigued by the volume in space and what you can do with it and how architecture is occupying space. So this, for me, this is still very intriguing matter. So I made some images that are dealing with that. And of course, like I said before, the typology is for me also very important, and you will see that in some images as well. So the first images I made began from existing structures like this one. It's a typical, I don't know if it's a typical Flemish phenomenon, but this is the side facade of a house waiting for another house that has to be built onto it, but in many cases this building will probably never come, so this is a kind of a blind facade, very in the beginning, a very abstract blind canvas. So for me it was very interesting to do their manipulation on it and give it a kind of identity by just folding this part of the facade inwards. I did it with some other existing buildings in Belgium. I don't only photograph in Ghent. I think Ghent is quite representative for the whole of Belgium, or especially Flanders. This is maybe interesting to talk about. This is also maybe, I don't know, the typical Flemish phenomenon, the back sides of townhouses. You often see them if you go by train to Brussels, for example, and you drive into the city center, you see all these wild architecture going on, often not visible from the public space, and that's why they look like that. You see this organically grown structures, often without permit, and most of the time, of course, the front facade is very official and has nice motifs and decoration, but the backside is often not visible and completely not detailed. So for me, this phenomenon of the back and the front, the back and the front side was for me very interesting to make an image that abstracts that mechanism even more by just erasing all the windows and the doors. So that this wild architecture, and then the building loses its initial functionality and becomes just a structure, because a house without a window, it isn't, you can't call it a house anymore. So it's becoming an abstract sculpture. And the same was done with this ensemble of volumes, just examining how scale and proportion and density has an effect on the building. This image, like I said, was for me important to give a comment on a certain modernistic tradition that is going on right now for a long time, of course. The modernistic tradition of the apartment block and stacking uniform apartments into one block with a tight grid. And for me, this is a building in Ghent, built in the 70s with these typical balconies, and every balcony has the same size, and every window has the same cadence. And in some cases, the inhabitants can even choose their own curtains in order to preserve the uniformity of that building. As uniformity is equality. I don't know, we can discuss about that. So I had the idea, if the people were able to just change their little outside space to their own needs and tastes, it could end up like this. A new, organically grown logic that is going into the building. And this is a reference of an earlier series of images I made of a social housing block in Ghent, just before demolition. So all the apartments were empty, and on the left-hand upper corner you see the original chimney that was present in every room. And throughout, if I walked from one apartment to the other, you saw how each inhabitant changed the chimney to their own taste. So you get a kind of sequence of a theme and variations. And the same technique or idea was implemented on the backside of that same apartment block. There were no balconies, there's only kind of grid with all the kind of same windows. And here I had the idea, how would the building look like if there was a kind of collective, uniform renovation of the facade. So you see all this same color of bricks that are breaking through the tight grid of the building at some point and gives, like a parasite, it's you see a parasite that is coming into the building. Also dealing with identity is this image this is not an existing image because maybe I have to say something about the techniques. So in the beginning I experimented on existing buildings. This is made from scratch. Of course, every part you see on this image is a photograph of a real window, but it was put together in a completely new building block. And it's the same. It's dealing about the same theme about identity versus uniformity, and how people can express, or were able to express their identity through one typology. Could deliver something like that. And I think it's a very actual discussion round, especially if you go to the Venice Biennale and what Avena did with some social projects. He built half a house. Of course, from a budgetary perspective, but also the other part could be built by the owner itself according to its own taste. So it's dealing about approximately about the same theme, in my opinion. Like I said, I was of course from the beginning, because it's a very early image, I made one of my first, I think, of course the building as a volume and as an expressive volume in space. And of course the cantilever is a very important technique in current architecture to give architecture a certain expressiveness. So in this image I pushed that to the limits. I think it's still possible. Sometimes people consider my images as impossible structures. I don't think so, because you will see later, I think they are still plausible. Of course, they are looking for the balance between reality and irreality, but I think it's not science fiction, because science fiction is something else, and that's a zone I don't want to walk in. So the plausibility is still very important. Of course, I'm not an engineer, so I'm guessing how this building, so I'm suggesting solutions to keep the things up. This says something from the beginning. I made some maquettes in the Lego blocks of my children and used it as a kind of canvas to make these images. Of course, So I photographed the maquette, I put it in Photoshop, and then I stuck fragments of photos of existing buildings onto that model, and then by adding shadows, very important, it becomes realistic. You will notice that all these buildings have a certain patina. They have a certain historic color, or they're sometimes worn out. For me, that's very important, because if I would use the current materials, I think they would resemble like the current renderings that architects often use to present their work, and I don't like that kind of aesthetic. So there has to be kind of back to the future like atmosphere. I call this my low-tech Frank Gehry. Another series I made earlier, when I was a student, I made this series of sheds on the Flemish or Belgian countryside. What attracted me to this way of building is the kind of authenticity. And in fact, it's a kind of non-architecture. It's often, or I think mostly, built illegally without a plan, just by farmers who need an extra space with leftover materials they had on their farm, and they made this, I think, very, very beautiful structures. This improvised way of building, and you see them everywhere in Flanders. If you go to Holland, you don't see them anymore. So I think it's maybe again a Belgian phenomenon. And often there's a kind of resemblance to the modernistic architecture that's quite funny. And that gave me the idea to make this image and to use the same aesthetics of this generic architecture, but on a bigger scale. And the tension I was looking for here was the tension between the improvised and the planned, because obviously these three towers, they indicate it was designed by an architect with a certain logic. But if you look at the elaboration of the facades, they have the aesthetic of kind of wild, like a montage, very well done. And apparently, and this may be a petit histoire, Rem Koolhaas was inspired by this picture to make a concert hall or a cultural center in Manchester, where he, for certain parts of the building, I'm pretty sure he saw my picture and translated it in one of his parts of his building. You see it. He's dealing with the same. Of course, it's a kind of contradiction, because this is very well thought and by me, and it's very constructed. Of course, in reality, these structures are not so well planned. So, like I said, typology, the roof. I made some stacking of this typology in a new constellation. This image is also dealing about the roof without a house under it. What is inside, what is outside? The same is going on here. Also introducing natural artifacts is for me quite interesting. I'm looking for a certain tension. You can ask yourself what was first, the buildings or this rock. The same is valid for this image. And this image, this panoramic image of San Francisco, is recreating the original topography of the city. Yeah? So I took a photograph of the skyline of San Francisco, then I imagined how the landscape looked like before the city was there. So if you go in the Bay Area, you can imagine how that place would look like before human occupation. So I photographed the landscape around the city and reintroduced it into the skyline. So you have a kind of combination of the original topography and the new topography of the buildings. So this tension, this time lapse that you can combine or compress two realities in time into one image is for me quite exciting. And of course, it was also quite interesting how this technique could be applied on other contexts. Like I said, I come from Ghent. I guess it has a specific character. That I was invited in France, in Deauville, a very posh bourgeoisie town on the Normandy coast with a completely other architectural tradition. So they asked me to make a series of images that is dealing about that very specific architectural heritage. So I walked around in the city and photographed this typical, how you call it, this graphic use of wood, and made a kind of inventory and compressed them again in new structures. Kind of a hyper-real, call it kind of hyper-reality of the actual situation. Of course, humor, you can imagine, is quite important for me as well. Of course, I know it's a very difficult thing in architecture. What is humor in architecture? I don't know. Maybe more a comment on the image of this city. You see these 3 villas in the back. This is the official nice side of that city, but there's also literally a backside of that city. If you go land inwards, you also see these structures in front. So I put these two together, two social realities into one image. This is maybe my most romantic image so far. Also the beach is of course, could be an interesting building site or a plane to build on. Of course they don't do it. It's a holy beach, so I imagined if you could build on the beach, something like that. There are no dunes in Deauville, so I photographed Belgian dunes. The house is in Deauville, so I combined these two. So I was also invited in Portugal, in Guimarães. It's a very typical Portuguese city. Again, with its very own architectural tradition, and here you see a condensed cityscape, because this is not the actual skyline of the city. I photographed 360 degrees. I made 360 degrees photos of the city and compressed them into one image. So this city skyline is much more compressed in real. And in this city there is a castle, a very iconic castle. I won't tell the history. For the Portuguese, it's the birth of the nation was there. It's politically and emotionally, it's a very important building. It's even the postcard of that city. So for me, that was very challenging to give a comment on this reconstruction, because it's not that old, that building. It's a romantic reconstruction to serve a political ambition of that city, for me, or even that country. So for me, it was quite interesting to manipulate or give a comment on this reality by restoring it in a quite doubtful way. And the same was done with the economic reality of that region, because the economy, it used to be a textile region, a very great prosperity in the past, but now due to the crisis, a lot of these factories were abandoned. So again, I made an inventory of all these abandoned factories and compressed them in a new Uber factory. So actually, the castle became a factory, and the factory became a castle. The same concept was here, right here. I also made a comment, but it's, I think, typical for every so-called historic city. A lot of the buildings you see are not that old, that that you think. So there is a kind of medieval palace that is built by a German architect in the 19th century. So for me, this trompe-l'œil of this building was for me the key to make this image and even make it more extreme and present the building as a kind of set piece. I also made an inventory of the typical way of using stone and coloring the joints between the natural stones. So I photographed hundreds of buildings that use this way of dealing with natural stone and compressed them in one typical building block in Guimarães. Also, the transgenic, maybe that's a difficult word, transgenic quality of this industrial landscape, or where the landscape goes over in the city and where's this kind of blurry line. Maybe it's interesting to talk about as well. This bridge is a tollway. It was built in the 80s to improve or to stimulate the economic activities in Portugal, and they linked every big city with this private tollways. You have to pay to drive on them, but due to the economic crisis, there are hardly any users on these tollways, and the people use again the old fabric of roads that run under these viaducts. So I made a kind of symbolic link between this public space under it, or this old infrastructure, and the new, actually private structure, by making a kind of totem of, again, generic architecture. And then I was invited in Holland also to make a series of images of a specific city in Zeeland, in Middelburg. And there I had the first idea, or the confidence, to propose an installation. And it resulted, I made one picture, again with the same technique, photographing the city from all angles and then compressing it in a much more dense skyline. Again, erasing all windows and trying to examine, if you erase certain specific characteristics of a city, can you still recognize the particular identity of that city? So where is it, when is the balance turning over? Can you still recognize it as a typical Dutch or Holland city? Probably can. And this picture, or this approach to the city, because the theme of this art manifestation was the facade of a building, and I used the roof as the fifth facade of a building in all its forms. And this gave me the idea to compress the city into one object. And I made this installation really in the middle of the city on a kind of square where different roads ended. And I made a kind of scaffold construction with the same size of a normal house in the city. It's 4 by 6 and 10 meters high. And I made a kind of spatial cubes where I put fake metal tile roofs in a certain sequence and a certain in certain combinations, so that again this roof as a fifth facade becomes a metaphor for the city in one sculpture. Of course, it's a reference to the image I made earlier. And then I discovered the brick. You will see in the following images that the brick is becoming more and more prominent. And for me, the brick is quite important. And in some way, it can replace the pixel, because I think the brick is the pixel of architecture. It has the ability, or it has the promise to become whatever you want. It's just a basic stone of everything, and a stone can become a wall, and a wall can become a house, and a house can become a street, and a street ends up in a city. So for me, this brick is for me the new pixel. So my first installation I made was in Hasselt, where in a museum-like building, and here you see my proposition. It's not the actual installation, but the Photoshop proposition I made to the museum. And I wanted to make corrections on the existing architecture of the building in a very abstract way, of course. So I made 3 interventions in the quite wide box spaces. One behind the big window by making reframing the view towards the city. And here you see the actual installation on 2 floors. You see this new alternative wall behind the existing window. And from the inside it looked like that. It was presented with an image I showed before. It's dealing with the same ideas. Little walls, unfinished walls in a corner, adapting itself to the little things that are going on the ground, the little grids and midlands. And then I made a column on a staircase. Very, again, the typology of a column is very common. Everybody knows, and it's nothing special. But if you put it on one step of a staircase, then it becomes something different. And especially if the appreciation of the column is completely different. If you go up the staircase, the view on the column and the appreciation of the column is completely different. And here, for me, it was also very important, and all these almost of the following installations you will see were always conceived with the notion, because I still have a photographic reflex, that I want to photograph these objects, because often temporary installation, they will disappear, so only the picture remains. So I'm photographing my own work. And it's quite intense and quite interesting, and also I want to make pictures that stand on its own, even if you didn't see that actual column. I think the picture has to say something as well. Bricks again. I made a column, a moving column on a Flemish field near a quite iconic house you see in the back. At least it's an iconic house in Belgium. It was built in the end of the 50s by a quite unknown but very interesting architect. He built it for his brother, and who is standing next to the column. With no budget, but it was a very interesting house. And was I don't show the house very specifically, but the site was very important, especially the architect, so the brother of this man who is standing there. He's dead already, but he began his career as an architect, and then he was fed up by the profession and he became an artist. So this totem, this stacking of bricks was kind of homage to this brave step this man took by just stacking these bricks in a very unlogical way. And now there's a movie, and a nice side effect was that the wind was playing this new kind of column inspired me to make this image a kind of architectural folly that gives a kind of comprehension of the column as a typology in architecture. So I think the column only bears a roof, so the column stands there for itself, it's not a functional building. And this image was presented in the Belgian pavilion in the Venice Biennale this year, and was in a section with another column. You see on the right, you see a new column. This is a project by an architect in Antwerp who refurnished an old bourgeoisie house into flats, and he had to manage with the tubes, with the drainage of the toilets and the bathrooms, and he introduced a new column right into the entrance of the building, and he covered it up with a kind of plasterboard sheetrock construction, and it becomes a new column in relation to the existing historic decorative columns. I won't speak about the general concept of, because I was one of the co-curators of the Belgian pavilion. We're dealing about scarcity in architecture and how architects can deal with scarcity, not only with budget, but also in all senses. And can you still produce interesting architecture if there are very, very restricting conditions? And this is one example how the architect dealt with this very non-romantic problem of training. So this was quite interesting. It was a bit the concept of the Venice Biennale to make one-to-one scales of fragments of buildings combined with images of my work. A new column. Actually, it's not a column. It's a buttress. I don't know if you understand English. You will see. It's a support. I think they still use it, and this is a new movie. Hopefully it plays. Again, a very specific site. It's a historic castle. A very old castle in quite bad condition. And here I had the idea about what is the issue of preservation of historic buildings, because you see in the back you see an old buttress, because this romantic idea has to be preserved. So this old castle, so they in a very unhandy and sometimes clumsy way they put buttresses or supporting walls against the wall of the castle in order that it won't collapse. So this typology of a buttress are reintroduced in a new way, because the buttress you see in the back is not touching the castle. Actually, it's standing 10 centimeters apart from the castle, and one is lying down on a floating platform. And it was called equilibrium. So it gives a comment on certain conditions, but at the same time, these structures has to keep themselves straight or in balance. So these typologies in architecture are meant to keep another building in balance. Here they have to keep themselves in balance. So this was a kind of doubling in meaning. Like I said, typologies is quite interesting for me, and here's one of the biggest installations I made so far in Kortrijk, in the west of Flanders, near a river. Kortrijk, they say from themselves that the river runs through the city, but I don't think so. The city is a bit turned away from the river, strangely. If you come to Ghent, you will see that the city is built around the water. Here the water runs not through the city but apart. So I made a gesture, an architectural gesture, by building a wall. In essence, it's a wall of 40 meters in length, and where all the very common typologies in architecture are used again as buttresses to keep the wall straight and standing up. So all these roofs and arches and chimneys, they prevent the wall from falling. Everything is also a bit downscaled to 4/5 of a normal scale. Again, we have this kind of very common typology in architecture, but they are placed in a certain sequence so it becomes something else. You can consider it as an unfolded house, or even the typical row buildings in Belgium, row houses. This one is still there. Apparently it works, it attracts people to sit around and enjoy the shade. I hope they once will light on the fire, but so far they didn't do it. A quite recent project was done in a gallery, in a commercial gallery in Antwerp, where I again built a wall. So, but not a very specific wall. I went to a bouwmarkt in Antwerp, and I bought 1 square meter of the most common bricks people use. So you don't see special bricks there, you see the very greased bricks. So I bought 1 square meter of every baked ceramic brick, concrete brick, and kind of cellular blocks. And in the gallery I made a new wall by making kind of patchwork of all these bricks in a certain composition. Again, as a metaphor for this, maybe you could say the city, the diversity of the city that exists of all kinds of individual choices. So this wall here, the wall is lying down on the left on the ground, and then the masons, they put stone by stone the same constellation in a vertical plane. And in the end, the wall looked like this. This is detail. This is the head of the wall. Again, a little side story. It reminds me of a building I saw on the Greek island this summer. And this tower is actually built with the same principle. It's a kind of Viking structure, or built during the Vikings or the Nordic people who conquered some islands of Greece, and they used material of older buildings. So here again you see a kind of two realities compressed into a new building. It's quite interesting. One of the last projects I want to show you is a more abstract way of dealing with architecture. This is a project I did in a space, in a museum-like space in Belgium, where I built a room, a square room based on the grid you see on the ceiling. You see these lines on the ceiling. This was used as the basis to make a room. And the contour of the room you can see here in front. You see the three walls, but the room doesn't exist in its original form. It was scattered or even exploded into different parts all over the space. So for me it was quite interesting research. If you walk through this remnants or this different parts, can you recompose the original space? Very tiny intervention. On the left you see the digital digital proposition, and on the right you see the actual situation. In a very white house, modernistic house, very clean. I reintroduced a little structure around the chair at a table. And it's dealing with really the essence of architecture. What is a wall? A wall is often dividing. It's a fold in space, and it's often making public into private. Can you do the same into a private space by just building a wall around the chair? You can't sit anymore on the chair. So this little space becomes something else. And this installation was called The Guest. And the joints were executed in a different way from the interior. You see the water coming out of the outside. And the last project I want to show is also in the same gallery where you saw the wall. And this is dealing, and this is a recent, it's not a discovery, but an awareness that in essence, I think architecture is also an obstacle in many ways. How beautiful architecture or how well designed architecture is, every time you have to conquer something. You have to open a door, you have to climb a stair, sometimes you hump into a wall, so there's also always a kind of clumsiness in architecture, I'm pretty sure. Or the space is too small, or has not the right proportion, so or the staircase is too steep. You have to open the door, but you have something in your hand. So there's always. So there was dealing with this kind of awareness, and I made two little interventions. One in the interesting part was that it was in the back office of the gallery. If you went into the official space of the gallery, you couldn't see these installations. So this was done with the toilet. So I built a little wall between the frame of the door and the door itself. And in the cellar, I made a kind of new alternative staircase. And the thing was that I only showed these pictures in the gallery. And to end this lecture and to celebrate my fascination for this new pixel, I made a breeze brick in real Carrara marble. Thank you for that.
Wow, thanks a lot. Actually, for me, it was really fascinating and to see the multidisciplinarity of your work. Of course, I knew before his work as a photographer, and also his work of the photo collages, but you even create and do installations, which photograph film. So it could be quite a bit. Then, so I would like to give the opportunity to ask some questions to Filip Dujardin. I have one, I start. I was wondering if you also make use of 3D modeling, lighting, shadowing, or because it was great to see that you make physical models before creating your photo collage. So is it just, because to me that's something completely different than just taking a picture and taking it to its optimum. By doing a photo collage, of course, you have totally other the shadows and to make it looking realistic. It's much more than just taking photo collage of different images. Is it just your photographic eye, or you also make use of 3D modeling somehow?
Maybe I didn't explain enough how the technical process behind these pictures is. In the end, like I said in the beginning, I made actual maquettes with this Lego box. Now I use 3D software to make the design, not to make it real. So I make with SketchUp, I make designs with certain realistic measures, and you can choose your own point of view by turning them up, and then you import that image into Photoshop, and then in a very traditional way, it's cut and paste. So I have all kinds of folders on my computer with concrete walls, brick walls, roofs. I can take pictures out of these folders and put them on the model. And then, of course, like you said, the shadow is very important. So from the beginning, I wanted to, or try to make very hyper-realistic images that at first sight you think this is real, but if you look closely, you will note that there's something going on. So there's a kind of always a process of looking at that image. At first glance, you think, what is this? And then something always gives it away that it's not real. I don't know, sometimes I don't know which thing gives it away. I do my best to make it as real as possible, but it's full of faults. Nevertheless. So these shadows are very important, but it's done very manually with brush. So it takes some time.
Other questions?
Ich glaube, es ist besser, der Interesse hat, jetzt noch weiter zu fragen. Die anderen haben Hunger und wollen ja noch.